A quick note before we begin. This episode discusses the making of Breakfast at Tiffany's, including references to some of its most iconic scenes and its ending. If you've never seen the film and would like to watch it first to avoid spoilers, we'll be here when you get back. And if you'd rather just jump in, that works too. Every episode of When They Were Making It is built to bring you into the story from the beginning. You don't need to know the film or the people behind it to enjoy the episode. Thank you. Truman Capote sits in the dark and watches a woman he created become someone else. On the screen, her name is still Holly Golightly. She still lives in Manhattan. She still throws parties. She still keeps a nameless cat, and she still drifts through rooms full of men who want something from her. But something essential is missing. The sharpness is gone. The danger has been polished away. The woman Capote wrote was wounded, unknowable, and impossible to possess. She didn't exist to be saved. She didn't explain herself, and she didn't reward anyone's love by becoming easier to understand. But this Holly is luminous. She's unthreatening. She's Audrey Hepburn. And that changes everything. The audience will laugh where Capote remembers pain. They will sigh where he remembers damage. And they will fall in love with the very thing he believes Hollywood has completely misunderstood. Because Hollywood hasn't adapted Holly Golightly, it's rescued her. It's taken the woman Capote built from abandonment, reinvention, loneliness, and survival, and dressed her in Givenchy, placed her before a jewelry store window, and sold it as elegance. On the screen, Audrey Hepburn smiles, her beautiful, dazzling, uncomplicated smile. And Truman Capote finally understands, in that darkened room, what he suspected all along. He's lost her. His Holly is gone. But Hollywood's Holly? Well, she's about to become immortal. Welcome to When They Were Making It. I'm your host, Patrick Rankin, and this is the podcast that dives deep into the glorious, often messy, and utterly human stories behind Hollywood's greatest films and the legends who created them. Today, we're exploring Breakfast at Tiffany's and how a slim, stylish, quietly subversive novella became one of Hollywood's most enduring images of elegance, and exactly how much it cost to get there. Holly Golightly wasn't invented. She was assembled from pieces of the women her creator knew and from the one who had damaged him the most. By 1955, author Truman Capote had already established himself as a literary sensation. His debut novel, Other Voices, Other Rooms, had made him famous at 23. By the mid-1950s, Capote, a small, high-voiced, openly and flamboyantly gay Southerner, was as well known for his public persona as for his prose. He was a fixture at Manhattan parties, quotable and controversial, recognized wherever he went. Between 1955 and 1958, Capote wrote Breakfast at Tiffany's in his basement apartment at 70 Willow Street in Brooklyn Heights. The neighborhood provided him with a setting similar to the brownstone world he was creating on the page. The same kind of a space where his heroine would live, transient and glamorous and slightly desperate. The story he was writing centered on Holly Golightly, a young woman who had escaped rural Texas and reinvented herself in Manhattan. She threw parties, took money from men, kept a nameless cat, and refused to commit to anything or anyone. She was what Capote called an American geisha, not exactly a prostitute, but a woman financially supported by wealthy men in exchange for companionship. The ambiguity was the point. Holly came partly from the women around Capote, and partly from Capote himself. Her charm, her survival instincts, her ability to slip between identities, all mirrored the boy who learned to perform his way through loneliness. Even her name carried his history. Holly's birth name, Lula Mae Barnes, echoed that of Capote's mother, Lily Mae Fulp. Lily Mae had abandoned him as a child, reinvented herself in New York society as Nina, and died in 1954, just before he began writing. The novella's themes of reinvention, abandonment, and performance were theirs, shared across mother and son. The rest of Holly came from Capote's glittering orbit. Babe Paley, wife of CBS chairman William S. Paley, embodied the flawless social grace Holly aspired to. Every gesture polished, every outfit immaculate. Author Doris Lilly made no apologies for enjoying the company and the gifts of wealthy men. Socialite Carol Marcus possessed the kind of beauty that opened any door. And dancer Joan McCracken moved through the world on her own terms, free, magnetic, and defiantly modern. The novella's narrator was an unnamed writer living in Holly's brownstone, widely understood as Capote's stand-in. He was strongly suggested to be gay, though this was never explicitly stated. Homosexuality in 1950s literature existed mainly through implication, not declaration. By late 1958, Capote had finished what would become his most controversial work thus far. Approximately 26,000 words that felt simple but carried real emotional weight and real scandal. A heroine who moved along the edge of prostitution, who lived firmly outside conventional morality, who refused to be saved or redeemed. An ending that offered no resolution, just Holly vanishing to Brazil with nothing settled. The novella was a cause célèbre even before being published. Harper's Bazaar purchased it for $2,000, then immediately regretted the decision. For a mainstream magazine, the novella's lurid content crossed too many lines, and their major advertiser, Tiffany & Co., might not appreciate having their name in the title. So Harper's backed out entirely. They had paid for the novella, but still refused to publish it. Esquire saw an opportunity. They purchased Breakfast at Tiffany's for $3,000. For a men's magazine, controversy might help sales. Esquire published the novella in their November 1958 issue without editorial changes. Random House released it in book form around the same time as part of a collection. The story made a splash, becoming a bestseller and sparking the kind of conversations that made publishers happy and ensured Hollywood would come calling. And call they did. On January 12, 1959, producers Martin Juro and Richard Shepard purchased the film rights for $65,000. The two had recently formed a production company and signed a deal with Paramount. This acquisition, Capote, controversy, and bestseller, would establish their reputation. For Capote, the sale meant validation. The price suggested the studio understood they'd acquired something valuable, and, although he had signed away control, he maintained cautious optimism that the right producers might preserve what he'd built. Paramount executives, on the other hand, recognized the problems instantly. Holly's profession, or lack thereof, her criminal ties, her semi-suggested queerness, her emotional damage, all would require softening or elimination entirely. The structure posed issues too. First-person narration by a possibly gay writer worked on the page of a splashy novella, but it didn't translate to a mainstream film. Still, Juro and Shepard understood that Holly had touched something in the American consciousness. Women admired her independence. Men were drawn to her mystery. If they could capture that without triggering censors, they might have something. They had their assignment: keep Holly's spirit, lose everything that made her Holly. In February 1959, they hired screenwriter Sumner Locke Elliott, an Australian-born writer known for his work on dramatic television programs like Studio One. Elliott had a reputation for psychological depth and complex character work, exactly what Capote's novella seemed to require. Elliott worked for months, crafting a screenplay that stayed close to Capote's melancholic tone. His Holly remained sharp-edged, vulnerable, difficult to categorize. His script preserved the novella's unresolved ending, Holly vanishing into uncertainty rather than finding romantic salvation. For a brief period, it appeared Capote's Holly Golightly might make it to screen unscathed and unsanitized. On May 25th, 1959, Paramount executives read Elliott's completed screenplay and fired him. The official reason, they stated, was overt effeminacy of male lead. But the real issue was broader. Elliott had stayed too close to Capote's vision. His Holly was too complicated, her independence too threatening, her ambiguity unmarketable to 1950s Hollywood. She would have to be cleaned up. The same day of Elliott's firing, Paramount hired screenwriter George Axelrod. Axelrod was already one of Hollywood's most successful adapters of risque material by 1959. He turned his own Broadway hit, The 7-Year Itch, into a film starring Marilyn Monroe that satisfied both censors and audiences, keeping the sexual tension between a married man and his neighbor while sanitizing the adultery. The result had been a massive hit for Billy Wilder in 1955. Axelrod understood the assignment immediately. this wouldn't be a touch-up. It would be a tear down. He worked through the summer of 1959, systematically rebuilding Capote's novella into something Paramount could sell. The unnamed narrator disappeared. In his place came Paul Varjak, a struggling novelist, heterosexual, Holly's age, living in her building. Not an observer, but a romantic lead. Axelrod gave him his own kept arrangement with a wealthy older woman mirroring Holly's situation. Two beautiful people surviving through compromise, recognizing each other, and falling in love. Holly herself became less coded call girl and more eccentric socialite. The American geisha was still there. Men still slipped her money in the powder room. But now it looked more like dates than transactions. To drive the point home, Axelrod even added a scene where Holly explicitly rejects a man trying to force his way into her apartment. But what changed most about Holly was her edge. Capote's Holly was dangerous and unknowable. Axelrod's was someone you could root for. Capote had written Holly fleeing to Brazil, unresolved and unreachable. Axelrod wrote a declaration of love, a kiss in the rain, Holly choosing commitment over escape. Her independence wasn't just rewritten, it was resolved. On August 14th, 1959, Axelrod delivered his completed screenplay. He had solved the censorship problems, transformed Capote's character study into a sophisticated romantic comedy, and made Holly sympathetic to mainstream audiences. Paramount was pleased. They'd done it. They'd solved Holly Golightly. Word of what Hollywood had done would eventually reach Capote. But by then, he was already consumed by something else. In November 1959, he'd read about a crime in Kansas. Brutal, inexplicable, raw. He went to investigate with childhood friend and author Harper, chasing a story that would consume the next 6 years of his life. The script for Breakfast at Tiffany's was done. What remained was finding a director who could sell this new romance, and a star willing to play what was left of its heroine. Hollywood had Holly now, and they had work to do. With Axelrod's screenplay approved in August 1959, Paramount had what it needed: a sanitized script that could get past the censors and into theaters. The project seemed to have everything going for it: a best-selling novella, a sophisticated romantic comedy. Now they focused on finding their Holly. Truman Capote, though ultimately hands-off from the production, had made one thing clear from the start. Marilyn Monroe was Holly Golightly. Not similar to her, was her. Everything he'd built into the character, the lower-class girl reinventing herself through sheer will, the survival instinct disguised as sexuality, Monroe had lived it. And he should know, they'd been close friends for years. Monroe was fresh off Some Like It Hot, and she was also fighting to be taken seriously as an actress, rather than continue to be dismissed as a sex symbol. Breakfast at Tiffany's might have provided a step in that direction, but her team had other ideas. Edward Perrone, who ran Monroe's production company, dismissed the screenplay in 3 words: "I think not." Lee and Paula Strasberg, her acting teacher and his wife, and 2 of her closest confidants, reinforced the concern. Holly took money from men. However you dressed it up, she was a call girl. Playing her would reinforce every image Monroe was trying to escape. So Marilyn Monroe said no, and Paramount didn't push. Shirley MacLaine, then filming The Apartment, Billy Wilder's romantic comedy in which she played a woman involved with a married man, was offered the part. She said no. She didn't think it was a very good script. Kim Novak was also considered. 1958's Vertigo had just proven she could handle transformation and complexity, but she passed too. Joanne Woodward received the screenplay, too serious an actress for what was a romantic comedy, no matter how sophisticated. Susie Parker had the fashion credentials, but not the acting experience. By early 1960, it was clear that Paramount had a problem. A script without a star. A production schedule that was slipping. And a growing sense that finding their Holly Golightly might not be as simple as they thought. Then someone at Paramount, accounts differ on who, suggested Audrey Hepburn. Born in Belgium, raised in wartime Netherlands, trained as a ballet dancer, Hepburn was slight, dark-eyed, with a look that defied the era's blonde bombshell standard. Gammon rather than sexpot. Hepburn had spent the 1950s becoming one of the most beloved actresses in the world. Her first starring role, in William Wyler's Roman Holiday in 1953, had won her an Academy Award. She played a European princess who slips her handlers for a single stolen day in Rome. Sabrina followed the next year, a Cinderella story about a chauffeur's daughter transformed by a year in Paris. Then Funny Face, a musical, and The Nun Story, for which she earned another Academy Award nomination. By 1960, Hepburn had an Oscar on her mantle, a Givenchy wardrobe, and an image that was, well, immaculate. She was everything Hollywood meant when it said class. The idea made no sense on paper. Hepburn was everything Holly wasn't. European elegance versus American restlessness. Brunette sophistication versus blonde desperation. Aristocratic restraint versus barely contained chaos. But the more Paramount thought about it, the more sense it made. Not creatively, strategically. Hepburn was one of the biggest stars in the world. Her participation meant instant prestige, instant box office, and instant respectability. Most crucially, her image would automatically sanitize whatever remained of Holly's moral ambiguity. Censors trusted Audrey Hepburn. Audiences trusted Audrey Hepburn. Middle America trusted Audrey Hepburn. But Hepburn would need to be convinced. Through early 1960, careful negotiations began. Hepburn's agent, Kurt Frings, became the gatekeeper, and her husband, Mel Ferrer, weighed in on every decision. Ferrer had been a fixture in Hepburn's life since 1953, when they met at a London party introduced by Gregory Peck. Ferrer was 12 years her senior, an actor and director with an established career, and from early on, he had strong opinions about hers. They had married in 1954, and in the years since, his influence over her professional decisions had become, to those around them, impossible to ignore. Friends noticed it, directors noticed it, colleagues noticed it. Hepburn, by all accounts, did not. Or if she did, she said nothing. In terms of Breakfast at Tiffany's, Ferrer wasn't so sure about his wife starring in something so deliberately provocative. Hepburn herself was hesitant, particularly about the timing. She was due to give birth in July, and taking the role meant being away from the baby, and that any filming would have to take place shortly after delivery. Yet, beneath the hesitation, something else was stirring. To Hepburn, the eternal ingenue was beginning to feel like a trap, and Holly was something else entirely. For an actress beginning to chafe against her own image, she was a risk worth considering. Paramount sweetened the deal with a landmark offer, $750,000, second only to Elizabeth Taylor's $1 million contract for Cleopatra. But money alone wouldn't close the deal. Hepburn and her team had safeguards, and one of them was the director. A director had actually been attached to the project since January of 1959. John Frankenheimer, who'd spent months working with Axelrod on the screenplay, attending meetings, offering notes, building his approach to what the film could be. Frankenheimer had made his reputation directing serious dramas for the television show Playhouse 90. Psychological intensity, moral complexity, characters who carried damage. Over the past few months, he had brought that same sensibility to Breakfast at Tiffany's. He was drawn to the darkness still visible beneath Axelrod's polish. If chosen to direct, his Holly would undoubtedly be at least somewhat wounded, complicated, morally ambiguous, even if this was a romantic comedy. However, when Hepburn's team reviewed who was attached, the response was swift and blunt. Hepburn had no idea who Frankenheimer was. Her agent made it clear. They wanted a bigger name, someone whose reputation could reassure a star being asked to take the biggest risk of her career. So Paramount let Frankenheimer go. Within 2 years, he would make The Manchurian Candidate, a Cold War thriller about a brainwashed assassin and his monstrous mother. Dark, uncompromising, the kind of film that showed exactly what he could do with dangerous material when his studio let him. Breakfast at Tiffany's, however, still needed a director. Someone who understood sophisticated comedy, could handle major stars, and knew exactly how to smooth Holly's sharper edges. Enter Blake Edwards. Edwards had just delivered the film Operation Petticoat, a Cary Grant military farce that earned $9.3 million. Universal's biggest success in a decade. Edwards had a name, he had credibility, and he had a hit. He was exactly what Paramount needed. Edwards flew to Switzerland, where Hepburn was living with Ferrer. The pitch was carefully calibrated for an audience deeply protective of her image, and that meant bringing Ferrer on side too. Edwards made his message clear. As he saw it, Holly didn't need to be understood. She needed to be cleansed, to be made safe for the censors, for the audiences, for Audrey Hepburn. And he was the man to do it. On April 22nd, 1960, Paramount made both announcements simultaneously. Audrey Hepburn would star in their adaptation of Breakfast at Tiffany's. Blake Edwards would direct. The larger Hollywood community understood immediately what the pairing meant. Paramount wasn't adapting Breakfast at Tiffany's. They were building a vehicle for their most bankable star, using Capote's title and character name as a launching point. The vision was clear. Now they needed to build a film around it. On July 17th, 1960, Audrey Hepburn gave birth to Sean Hepburn Ferrer in Lucerne, Switzerland. The delivery was difficult. Her doctors ordered weeks of recovery before she could travel, let alone work. Paramount's production schedule, already tight, compressed further. The start date pushed from September to October. But there was no alternative. They had committed to Hepburn, and Hepburn needed time. Meanwhile, Edwards still didn't have his male lead. Steve McQueen was the first name on everyone's list, a rising star from the Western television series Wanted, Dead or Alive, who was just starting his career in movies. But he couldn't get out of his television contract. So Edwards pushed for his own choice, Tony Curtis. The producer said no. Robert Wagner's name came up in meetings. Nothing there materialized. That summer, Paramount cast George Papard. Papard was in his early 30s, handsome in a brooding way, fresh off of a National Board of Review award for Home from the Hill, Vincent Minnelli's Southern family melodrama starring Robert Mitchum. He trained under Lee Strasberg at the Actors Studio. Method all the way, committed to psychological depth, to finding truth in every scene. Edwards didn't want him. The problem wasn't talent. Papard was good, but Edwards knew what method actors did. They excavated the damage, the moral compromises, the complexity of a script. The very things Axelrod and Paramount had worked so hard to eliminate. Edwards knew the part of Paul Varjak needed someone who could be charming without digging, light without weight. A leading man who understood this was a romantic comedy, not a dissection. Edwards would later say he dropped to his knees on the sidewalk in front of producers Juro and Shepard and begged them not to cast Papard. But they stood firm. Papard was available, he fit the bill, and cameras were now months away. The rest of the cast fell into place. Patricia Neal was cast as 2E, the wealthy woman keeping Paul. Buddy Epson would play Doc Golightly, Holly's ex-husband from her Texas past. And then there was the question of Mr. Yunioshi, Holly's Japanese neighbor. In Capote's novella, Mr. Yunioshi was a minor character, a photographer who appeared briefly, unremarkable and barely sketched. Axelrod's script had expanded him into comic relief. Brief appearances, exaggerated reactions, the butt of the joke. Richard Shepard one of the film's producers, wanted to at least cast an actual Japanese actor for the role. But Edwards had other ideas. He cast Mickey Rooney. Rooney was 40 years old, a veteran performer, and about as Japanese as Paramount Pictures. But Edwards wanted comedy, big, broad, unmistakable laughs that would balance the rest of the movie's sleek sophistication. And Rooney, the former child star turned character actor, promised to deliver. The role would be played in yellowface, prosthetic teeth to create an exaggerated overbite, tape pulling at the corners of his eyes, an accent that bore no resemblance to how Japanese people actually spoke, and physical shtick borrowed from vaudeville stages where ethnic caricature was standard comedy. And while Hepburn recovered in Switzerland, pre-production accelerated in Hollywood. Edwards had made his intentions clear from the start. The film would have a look. What Holly had lost in complexity, the film would compensate for in style. Sophisticated, fashionable, and unmistakably Manhattan. Not grand or forbidding, but chic. The kind of world where, like its heroine, elegance and eccentricity occupied the same room without explanation. Holly's brownstone apartment went up on the Paramount lot. Mismatched thrift store finds mixed with elegant touches, where a bathtub became a couch and a wooden crate became a coffee table. Every detail was made to look quirky, charming, bohemian, and aspirational all at once. The exterior brownstone was built to match the New York location they'd shoot when the time came. And then came the question of what Holly Golightly would actually wear. Audrey Hepburn was known for fashion on and off the screen, with Sabrina being the clearest example of what that meant. A wardrobe that was chic, precise, and impossible to separate from the film itself. And in a film where surfaces mattered so much, the clothes would do as much work as the dialogue. For Paramount, the answer to who would provide the fashion was obvious: Edith Head. Head was the studio's chief costume designer, a 6-time Academy Award winner who had dressed every major star on the lot. She understood studio politics, censorship boundaries, and exactly how to make actresses look glamorous within the system's constraints. But Hepburn's contract said otherwise. Since Sabrina in 1954, she had worked almost exclusively with Hubert de Givenchy, the Parisian couturier who had dressed her in every film where the studio would allow it. Their partnership had become inseparable from her public image, and by now it was in her contract. When she worked on a film, she worked with Givenchy. Head wasn't pleased. She had spent decades building her reputation as the definitive Hollywood costume designer. And here was a Parisian outsider being handed the film's most visible work. On her lot, on her picture. But Hepburn had no reason to budge, and she didn't. The compromise, when it came, was a practical one. Givenchy would design the key pieces, the gowns, the cocktail dresses, the opening look. Head would design everything else. In the credits, her name would come first as costume supervisor, with Givenchy acknowledged separately for Hepburn's wardrobe. Pieces like the black dress in the opening scene, sleeveless elegant, paired with opera-length gloves, pearls, and tiara, would be pure Givenchy, designed in Paris and shipped to Hollywood. While everything else was getting prepped for filming, producer Martin Giraud had been working a separate problem, getting Tiffany & Co. itself on board. It wasn't a straightforward ask. The company had already made clear how they felt about their name in connection with Capote's story. Their discomfort had been part of why Harper's Bazaar walked away from publishing the novella years earlier. Now Paramount was asking them to open their flagship store to a film crew for the same story. While they were initially still apprehensive, Giraud was able to bring them around. The simple fact was, the script said nothing bad about Tiffany's. It actually said quite the opposite. Holly adored Tiffany's. She went there because it made her feel safe. Because nothing very bad, she believed, could ever happen at Tiffany's. For a jewelry store, that was hardly a liability. The negotiations produced carefully controlled terms. Tiffany's would open on a Sunday, an exception the store hadn't made in decades, with about 40 armed guards stationed throughout. Henry B. Platt, great-great-grandson of the founder, would personally oversee the arrangement. As part of the partnership, Hepburn was photographed wearing one of their most legendary pieces, the Tiffany yellow diamond, set in a necklace created by their designer Jean Schlumberger. Hepburn was one of the very few women ever to wear the stone, valued at about $544,000, roughly $6 million today. The diamond itself wouldn't appear in the finished film, but the photographs would provide major publicity for both Paramount and Tiffany's. By early October, production was ready to begin. Hepburn had recovered enough to travel. The rest of the cast was ready. The sets were built, the crew hired, the insurance secured, and Tiffany & Co. was waiting. Whatever Holly Golightly had become, it was time to find out. During the early morning of October 2nd, 1960, Audrey Hepburn stepped out of a yellow cab onto Fifth Avenue, wearing large sunglasses and a black Givenchy dress, carrying a paper takeout bag, a cup of coffee, and a Danish pastry. She walked to the window of Tiffany & Co.'s flagship store at 727 Fifth Avenue and stood there, eating her pastry, sipping her coffee, gazing at the diamonds behind the glass. Fifth Avenue stretched wide and silent behind her, impossibly empty for Manhattan, even at dawn. This was the filming of the opening shot of Breakfast at Tiffany's, and nothing about it was simple. The cast and crew were working under the strict terms Tiffany's had set, and against the clock. Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev was in New York for the UN General Assembly, and his motorcades would be cutting through Midtown with heavy security. The production reportedly had to clear Fifth Avenue by 7:30 in the morning. Hundreds of onlookers had also gathered, despite the early hour and the freezing temperature, visible to the crew but kept out of frame. Hepburn was nervous. She was only 11 weeks removed from giving birth to her son Sean, who was back in Switzerland. The reality of embodying Holly Golightly, the party girl, the extrovert, the fictional antithesis to everything Hepburn was starting to hit, and she genuinely disliked the Danish pastries she'd have to nibble repeatedly. But the filming itself went quickly. Edwards later described it almost reverently. The traffic lull on Fifth Avenue came at exactly the right moment, as if fortune had decided to cooperate. They captured what they needed and moved on. The production spent 8 days filming in New York City that early October, a small crew working fast to capture exteriors before returning to the Paramount lot. The challenge wasn't weather or logistics, it was attention. Almost every news outlet in the city was hunting for photographs of Audrey Hepburn. Crowd control became a daily negotiation between capturing spontaneity and managing the spectacle of a major Hollywood production in the middle of Manhattan. They filmed at 169 East 71st Street, where Holly's apartment building stood with its green and white striped awning, a production addition that would stay on the building for years. New York Public Library on Fifth Avenue and 42nd Street for exteriors only, and various other Manhattan locations. After a week of managing crowds and chasing empty streets, they had what they needed. They packed up and moved back to Hollywood. The remaining 4 months would unfold on the Paramount lot, where Edwards could control the environment and work at his preferred pace. And that pace was quick, efficient, spontaneous. Edwards wanted performances that felt effortless, natural, unforced. Where other directors might drill actors through multiple takes until every gesture was perfect, Edwards preferred to catch the first good take and move on. He trusted his instincts and expected his actors to trust theirs. This approach worked beautifully with Hepburn. Since taking the role of Holly Golightly, she had been vocal about her apprehension to embodying someone so opposite to herself. She didn't know how to become someone she fundamentally wasn't. This had turned not just to worry over a difficult part, but to genuine onset anxiety. She needed constant reassurance since the day she said yes, from Edwards, from her agent, from anyone who'd listen. Under Edwards' direction, she started to find a way forward. She responded to his lightness, his trust, his refusal to overwork moments. He pushed her to trust her instincts rather than construct a performance. Her Holly began to take shape, softer than Capote's original, less chaotic, something quieter in its place. She was starting to find her footing. At home, her husband, Mel Ferrer, wasn't so sure. He had his own ideas about how Holly should be played, and he made them known. What Edwards would build with Hepburn during the day, Ferrer would quietly unpick in the evenings, offering his own notes, his own direction, his own vision of what Holly should be. Edwards began to notice it, but there was little he could do. To the rest of the cast and crew, something else was becoming apparent. Ferrer just wasn't nice to her. One evening, the company gathered for dinner. Hepburn, distracted, put her elbows on the table. Ferrer, seated beside her, slipped a fork between her elbows and said, loudly enough for everyone to hear, "Ladies do not put their elbows on the table." The room went quiet. Hepburn said nothing. On set, it was becoming harder to ignore how much Hepburn was carrying. The role, the anxiety, the insecurity about whether any of it was working. And now this. But she absorbed it the way she seemed to absorb everything. Quietly. Edward's approach to directing didn't work quite as well with George Papard. Papard, true to his method credentials and just as Edwards had anticipated, wanted to dig into Paul's moral compromises, explore the shame of being kept by a wealthy older woman, find the character's psychological truth. Edwards would keep scenes light. Papard would try to add weight. Edwards would call cut and move to the next setup. Papard would still be standing on his mark, ready to keep going. At first, it looked like a clash of approaches, but it quickly and clearly became something else. Papard wasn't just intense. He was difficult to work with. Cast and crew began to lose patience with his arrogance and his superiority. Hepburn, who typically had a kind word for everyone on set, made a rare exception. She thought he was pompous. Patricia Neal, who played Paul's wealthy keeper, 2E, had known him from their actor's studio days and arrived expecting someone she'd adored. Instead, she later said, "Since I last saw him, he had grown so cold and so conceited." In the original script, 2E was a commanding presence, a woman who held real power over Paul Varjak. But Papard didn't want to be seen in that position on screen. He argued repeatedly to have her dominance softened, which in turn meant having much of Neal's dialogue cut. Edwards relented, and much of the character of 2E wouldn't make it to the final film. Not because Edwards wanted it gone, but because Papard kept pushing until he got his way. But the Neal situation was only one front in Papard's ongoing war with Edwards. It was constant now, the arguments, the standoffs, and one day the tension finally broke. During a blocking session, voices started to rise and rise. The two men moved towards each other, close enough that crew members stopped what they were doing and started to watch, uncertain whether they were about to come to blows. Patricia Neal ended up having to intervene. "I got them to stop," she later recalled, "but I think George got his way. I hated him from that moment on." Production moved on to a sequence in the script in which Holly throws a party in her apartment. In Axelrod's screenplay, there was only a brief indication of what that meant. A few details, 2 or 3 lines of dialogue. The rest would have to be improvised. And improvise was what Edwards did. He brought in 120 gallons of soft drinks, 60 cartons of cigarettes, hot dogs, cold cuts, potato chips, dips, sandwiches. A beekeeper's smoker was set up to create authentic cigarette haze. And he ordered cases of real champagne and told everyone to drink it. This wasn't going to look like a party. It was going to be one. The partygoers were Edward's people. Actors he knew, friends of friends, people he trusted to actually drink and smoke and behave the way real partygoers would. As he put it, I wanted real actors because I didn't know who I was going to give things to, and I wanted to be sure they could handle it. He encouraged everyone to contribute ideas of outrageous behavior and directed visual gags as they emerged. A woman whose hat caught fire while she kept talking. A man in an eye patch, removing it mid-argument to reveal both eyes were perfectly fine. a woman laughing hysterically into a mirror, then, a shot later, crying into it just as hysterically. I just turned them loose, Edwards later explained, and they led me into inspirational kind of moments. It took 6 days of filming to get just right, and became one of the most expensive party scenes Paramount had ever shot. The Unioshi scenes were filmed like any other sequence on the schedule. Mickey Rooney delivered his performance with the same vaudevillian energy Edwards had hired him for. He stumbled and flailed, fell over furniture, took pratfalls across the stage. His sketchy, faux Japanese accent, prosthetic teeth, and taped eyes were creating exactly the broad caricature Edwards wanted, and Edwards encouraged every take. This was the comedy in the romantic comedy he'd promised Paramount. In his opinion, the unmistakable laughs that would make the film accessible to mainstream audiences. Production ground forward. Hepburn's baby son, Sean, arrived on set from Switzerland, accompanied by his nurse. She'd been away from him for months, and the separation had added to the toll she felt during filming. Another weight on top of everything else. But by now, the production had found its unsteady rhythm. Hepburn, while still uncertain, was finding her way. Papard and Edwards maintained a cold but workable standoff, and footage was accumulating. Then, they filmed the scene that would change everything. The scene would have Holly on her fire escape, playing guitar and singing a song to herself and her cat. No audience, no performance, just a moment of private feeling. And when they filmed it, something shifted. Hepburn's voice was small, uncertain, unpolished. She wasn't a singer and had no technique to hide behind. So what showed up on screen was just her voice, fragile and exposed, singing words about a place where she might feel safe. It didn't look like the Holly they'd been filming up until now. Not the charming party girl, not the winsome ingenue. This was someone else. Someone alone, unguarded, real. Whatever they'd captured here didn't seem to match the rest of the footage. This wasn't the romantic comedy they'd been building. This was something else entirely. For the first time, the film contained something it hadn't quite planned for. Production on Breakfast at Tiffany's wrapped on February 3rd, 1961. The cast and crew scattered. Hepburn went back to work. William Wyler's The Children's Hour with Shirley MacLaine already waiting. Papard moved on to How the West Was Won. And Edwards went into the editing room. Holly Golightly had survived rewrites, recasting, reinvention. Now came the last transformation that would define her once and for all. What to keep, what to lose, and what story the edit would finally tell. The fate of Holly Golightly was now in Howard A. Smith's hands. Smith had started his career as an editor cutting film at Hal Roach Studios in 1935. Laurel and Hardy shorts, Our Gang comedies, work where timing mattered and every frame counted. He'd spent over 26 years perfecting the art of finding the story hidden inside raw material. Now, in early 1961, he faced reels and reels of footage that couldn't decide what story it wanted to tell. As he watched the Breakfast at Tiffany's footage, it was becoming increasingly clear he'd inherited a romantic comedy that had no idea what it wanted to be. It wasn't exactly a mess, but it wasn't exactly anything. The material was already heavily sanitized. Axelrod's screenplay had stripped away most of Capote's darkness months ago. But Edwards' footage still kept some of it. It kept wavering between sophisticated comedy and something heavier. Hepburn's performance carried an undertow of melancholy that surfaced in unexpected moments. Papard's intensity in some scenes was unexpected as well. So Smith's assignment was clear. Keep it light. Preserve the sophisticated comedy Edwards had promised to deliver, smooth away the contradictions, and make it feel deliberate. Through February and March, Smith worked in his editing room at Paramount, Edwards supervising closely. Scenes accumulated on the cutting room floor. A carousel scene, an extended bath preparation that Life magazine had reportedly featured. The party footage, 6 days of elaborate shooting, was carved down to something tighter, funnier, more controlled. While Smith and Edwards worked through the cuts, the film's screenwriter was fighting for a cut of his own. Axelrod had expanded the character of Mr. Yunioshi from Capote's novella, a brief human presence in the original, giving him a larger role in the screenplay. But what Edwards and Rooney had made of the role was something Axelrod hadn't written, didn't recognize, and didn't like. In fact, he was appalled by Rooney's portrayal. Not by the racial stereotyping of it, but by what it did to the film. The tonal whiplash was too jarring. Every time Yunioshi appeared, Axelrod argued, the film lost whatever reality it had built. It broke the picture. Edwards firmly disagreed. He'd said it throughout production, and he was saying it now. The character gave the picture lift. It was funny. Now, with the film nearing completion and time running out, Axelrod took matters into his own hands. He arranged for Hepburn to return to set, even though principal photography had wrapped, to reshoot the scenes involving Yunioshi with a different actor. Hepburn herself agreed to do it for nothing. When Edwards found out, he shut it down. The footage, and Mickey Rooney as Mr. Yunioshi, would stay in the picture exactly as shot. While Smith worked through those winter months, the music that would define the film had been taking shape since the previous summer. When he signed on, Blake Edwards had chosen Henry Mancini as Tiffany's composer over the producer's objections. Giroux and Shepard wanted a Broadway name, someone who'd give the film a sophisticated Manhattan sound. Edwards wanted Mancini, his frequent collaborator from projects like the Peter Gunn television series. The studio relented, but with conditions. Mancini could compose underscore, not songs. Mancini had other ideas. Through Edwards, he convinced Giroux and Shepard to let him try writing one. Throughout the 4-month shoot, Mancini studied Audrey Hepburn, specifically her voice. He'd seen her sing in Funny Face. He knew her range barely crossed an octave, knew that she had no technique to hide behind. Whatever he wrote would have to work within those constraints. The melody eluded him for weeks. He sat down regularly, came up with nothing. Then, one evening, drinking, thinking about Holly Golightly, it came to him. 3 notes, almost childlike. Half an hour later, the song was written. For lyrics, he brought in Johnny Mercer, 2-time Oscar winner, co-founder of Capitol Records, and one of the most celebrated lyricists in American popular music. He worked quickly, delivering lyrics that captured the longing and restlessness of the film's heroine. They called the song Blue River, then changed it to Moon River after discovering the song title had already been taken several times over. It was this song that Audrey Hepburn sang on the Paramount lot during the film's quiet moment on the fire escape. There had been talk of bringing in Marnie Nixon, the ghost singer who had dubbed Natalie Wood in West Side Story and would later dub Hepburn herself in My Fair Lady, to provide Hepburn's vocals. But Edward said no. The song had been written for her voice, and more importantly, Holly Golightly wasn't supposed to sound polished. She was a girl outside her apartment with a guitar, singing to herself and her cat. Hepburn's limitations fit perfectly. During March and early April, while Smith cut the picture, Mancini orchestrated the rest of the film's score. And by April 7th, they had the music pretty much locked and a viewable edit ready to go. Preview screenings began, and the response from test audiences was strong. They loved the story, the music, the party sequence, the romantic tension, and they loved Hepburn's Holly. Charming, quirky, glamorous. Even Hepburn herself was pleased with what she'd done. And for someone who had spent months convinced she was wrong for the part, that was no small thing. Her husband, however, who attended a preview screening with her, only had one comment after the credits rolled. "I liked your hat." Otherwise, Paramount's cleaned up Breakfast at Tiffany's seemed to be landing. There was only one problem. A big one, according to one person with a lot of power. After a San Francisco screening, Paramount production chief Martin Racken gathered with the filmmakers. Hepburn, Edwards, Mancini, the producers, and made his position clear. The film worked. The audience was with it. But there was one thing he believed was slowing the whole thing down. One thing that had to be cut. Moon River. Racken was blunt. The fucking song has to go. What followed became disputed. Hollywood legend has Hepburn rising to her feet, declaring, "Over my dead body." Mancini later disputed this, admitting, however, it was the closest he ever saw her come to losing her composure. Producer Shepard would later claim he and Juro were the ones who had declared over their dead bodies, while Hepburn sat ready to speak. Whatever actually happened in that room, one thing was clear. Hepburn, Edwards, and the producers were adamant. The song stayed. Breakfast at Tiffany's would keep its one moment of truth. Through summer 1961, Paramount prepared Breakfast at Tiffany's for release. The marketing challenges had been clear from the start. Even with its squeaky clean makeover, Breakfast at Tiffany's resisted simple categorization. A romantic comedy that wasn't quite a comedy. A love story built around a woman whose profession wasn't quite clear and couldn't be named. A sophisticated Manhattan fairy tale with edges they'd spent months smoothing away. The solution was something they came up with during filming. Capote's Holly had been explicit. A woman who took money from men, who lived outside respectable society, whose story ended ambiguously and alone. Everyone who'd read the novella knew exactly what she was. Paramount needed a different Holly. So they chose a word to encapsulate her. A word that meant everything and nothing at the same time. Holly was a kook. A press release had gone out during production, quoting cast and crew on what the word meant. Producer Martin Giraud, for instance, offered his own definition. A kook is a kitten who will never grow up to be a cat. But Paramount also wanted to avoid any connotation with the beatnik subculture that had taken hold in the late 1950s. The coffee houses, the bongos, the rejection of mainstream values. Holly was bohemian, yes, but she was Givenchy bohemian. Fifth Avenue bohemian. The press release made this explicit. Kook was not a beatnik term, because the star is Audrey Hepburn, not Tawdry Hepburn. The kook campaign wasn't the only publicity stunt Paramount had been running. While the film was still in production, the studio had put out a series of press releases announcing that Mr. Yunioshi would be played by a Japanese comedian named Ohio Arigato, which translates from Japanese roughly as "Good morning, thank you." The releases included fake quotes attributed to the non-existent comedian, written in phonetically broken English, as well as an invented backstory about Arigato's arrival in Hollywood. Leasing his home in Tokyo to pay for his trip to Hollywood, demanding that production wait while he studied at the actor's studio, and even asking for top billing. Eventually, Rooney revealed himself. He appeared before the press in full costume and prosthetic makeup, issuing a statement that confirmed what the studio had been having fun with. By October, the film was finished. Polished, expensive, star-driven. A romantic comedy that seemed to satisfy every requirement Paramount had set when they bought the rights nearly 3 years earlier. The content had been transformed. Axelrod's rewrites, Edward's carefully managed surfaces, Hepburn's Holly. What had emerged was sleek, sophisticated, and commercially viable. It just wasn't Capote's story anymore. As the film's premiere date approached, everything seemed to rest on a single question. How much would that matter? On the evening of October 5th, 1961, Radio City Music Hall hosted the world premiere of Breakfast at Tiffany's. The elaborate stage presentation featured the New York Naval Shipyard Choir, singer Everett Morrison, the Rockettes, and dancer Istvan Hrabovsky. Nearly 6,000 seats filled with Hollywood royalty, Manhattan society, and critics sharpening their pens. The reviews arrived mixed. Variety called it unconventional but dynamic entertainment, celebrating how, in the exciting person of Audrey Hepburn, she, Holly, comes vividly to life on the screen. The New York Times described it as a completely unbelievable but wholly captivating flight into fancy. Time magazine cut closer to the bone. Audrey Hepburn, though she plays with fluent wit and gives the customers a spectacular fashion show, isn't really Holly. Audiences didn't seem to care. By year's end, the film had grossed $14 million worldwide against its $2.5 million budget. One of 1961's biggest commercial successes. The verdict was in. Breakfast at Tiffany's was a hit. Well, not to Truman Capote. Capote called it the most miscast film I've ever seen. He said it made him want to throw up. And he told anyone who would listen that Paramount double-crossed me in every way possible and cast Audrey. His fury wasn't just about Hepburn, though he would never forgive that casting. It was about everything they'd done to Holly, transformed her from survivor to sweetheart, from damaged to darling, from a woman who couldn't be caught into a woman who chose to be saved. For the rest of his life, Capote would describe the adaptation as a betrayal, not just of his work, but of Holly herself. At the Academy Awards ceremony on April 9th, 1962, the film received 5 nominations. Audrey Hepburn was nominated for Best Actress. She lost to Sophia Loren for Two Women. George Axelrod's screenplay was nominated, but lost. Art direction, too. Henry Mancini, however, won 2 Oscars, Best Original Score and Best Original Song, alongside lyricist Johnny Mercer for Moon River. Breakfast at Tiffany's seemed destined to be remembered for what it was, a pleasant success. Commercially viable, critically respectable, but not particularly important. Another well-crafted entertainment from the studio system, and another Audrey Hepburn vehicle that had done its job and moved on. The people who had made it moved on too, carrying the film with them in different ways and to different degrees. Audrey Hepburn, after filming The Children's Hour, went on to Charade, My Fair Lady, dozens more films. Her marriage to Mel Ferrer ended in 1968, 14 years after it began. She said little about it publicly. In her later life, she became a UNICEF ambassador and devoted herself to humanitarian work. But when she looked back on her career, she called playing the extroverted Holly in Breakfast at Tiffany's the hardest thing I ever did. For Henry Mancini, Breakfast at Tiffany's elevated his career to a different level. He went on to win 20 Grammys and 4 Oscars over his career. And through it all, Moon River would remain his signature. George Papard worked steadily for decades, finding his second act with the television show The A-Team. Action and charm, no psychological excavation required. And Blake Edwards followed the path Breakfast at Tiffany's had set, building the Pink Panther franchise and going on to 10 and Victor Victoria. Truman Capote, meanwhile, would go on to release his magnum opus, The Kansas murders that had pulled his attention away during production became In Cold Blood, published in 1966. The true crime book that would be hailed a masterpiece and redefine the genre. The last decades of his life were spent in a long public unraveling. He died in 1984, still talking about what Paramount had done to Holly Golightly. In the meantime, something unexpected had happened. Breakfast at Tiffany's had stopped behaving like a movie and started living as an image. The look, the black Givenchy dress, the opera gloves, the cigarette holder, the pearls, became shorthand for modern elegance. Department stores sold copies of the little black dress. Fashion magazines reprinted the image endlessly. People who had never seen the film recognized it instantly. In 2006, one of the Givenchy gowns made for the opening scene sold at Christie's for nearly $1 million. Moon River made a similar leap. Frank Sinatra recorded it. Andy Williams recorded it. By the late 1960s, hundreds of covers existed, and the original was buried beneath them, which is to say, it had become something larger than a song from a movie. Tiffany & Co., once anxious about Capote's scandalous source material, discovered they had acquired one of their finest advertisements. The Fifth Avenue store became a landmark people visited not to shop, but to stand outside and remember a film. Through the 1960s and beyond, Breakfast at Tiffany's was canonized by film schools, filled revival houses, its poster pinned in dorm rooms across the country and beyond. It did what no one had expected. It outlasted its moment entirely. The National Film Registry added it in 2012. The American Film Institute hailed it among the greatest romantic comedies. Moon River entered the Grammy Hall of Fame. But as the film's stature grew, so did its complications. What some critics had warned about in 1961, such as The Hollywood Reporter, which noted that Mickey Rooney's yellow-face caricature would be offensive to many, had aged from uncomfortable to indefensible. The performance that once registered as broad slapstick now appeared as what it was: a white actor in prosthetic teeth and taped eyelids, speaking an exaggerated accent, playing a Japanese man as a buffoonish stereotype. By the 1990s, activists were protesting screenings. In 2008, a Sacramento outdoor event was canceled entirely. A Brooklyn Bridge Park screening 3 years later proceeded only after organizers acknowledged the controversy. In 2022, a UK broadcaster edited out the Unioshi scenes entirely. The film became a case study, one of Hollywood's most egregious examples of yellowface. What had been ignored or dismissed for decades was now impossible to defend. Director Blake Edwards expressed regret near the end of his life. "I would give anything to be able to recast it." Mickey Rooney? Not so much. Never in all the more than 40 years after we made it, not one complaint, he said in 2008. "Every place I've gone in the world, people say, 'God, you were so funny.' Asians and Chinese," his words, "come up to me and say, 'Mickey, you were out of this world.' Those that didn't like it, I forgive them. And God bless America. God bless the universe. God bless Japanese, Chinese, Indians, all of them, and let's have peace. Producer Richard Shepard seemed to voice the more common sentiment. If we could just change Mickey Rooney, I'd be thrilled with the movie. Yet through all of it, through the deserved reassessments and protests and content warnings, the film had done something Capote could never have imagined. It became more famous than the source material, more influential than almost any film from 1961, more culturally pervasive than anyone involved could have predicted. The film wasn't Capote's vision. It couldn't be. Yet it became something else entirely. A work audiences embraced not because it preserved the original truth, but because it was irresistible. More than 60 years later, when people think of Breakfast at Tiffany's, they don't think of Capote's damaged, complicated heroine. They see Audrey Hepburn in a black dress. They hear Moon River. They remember A Kiss in the Rain. Maybe that's what the adaptation ultimately achieved. Not preservation, not betrayal exactly, but transformation. Capote's Holly was wounded, unknowable, impossible to hold. Hollywood's Holly was softer, more luminous, something the world could fall in love with. And in the end, that's exactly what it did. That's a wrap on this week's episode of When They Were Making It, an hour look behind the scenes of Breakfast at Tiffany's. I'm Patrick Rankin, writer, producer, and your host. Original artwork by Simone Beach, and original music by Lionel Zablat. Thank you for listening and for helping keep these stories alive. For access to bonus episodes and exclusive content, stay tuned for our Patreon, launching later this month. You can also follow along on Instagram and TikTok. We are When They Were Making It on both. If you're enjoying the show, please follow us in whatever app you're listening in. It means every new episode lands automatically, and it's the clearest signal to Apple and Spotify that these stories are finding an audience. But the honest truth is a show like this doesn't grow on ads or algorithms. It grows because one person hears it and tells another. So if this was worth your time, tell someone. That does more than anything else. Until next time, keep watching. And remember, behind every great film is an even greater story.